Exodus chapter 2. And as you're flipping over there, I'm reminded, when I kind of was going through this study, I was reminded there was an old movie in the 90s that had Martin Short in it. And the premise of the movie was there was a woman who got lost. And they were trying to find her. And her father was this very wealthy man. And come to find out that the story is she's probably one of the most unlucky women on the planet. And so the theory was, how do we find the most unlucky woman on the planet? Let's find the most unlucky man on the planet, and then let's set him down the same path that she went on and see if they stumble into each other somehow. And so it is. It's finding somebody who anything that could ever go wrong goes wrong with the guy, and then you follow the journey of, does he get there or not? And so today we're going to be looking at something that as we unfold this chapter, there's a lot of things that just seem to click. There's a lot of things that just seem, as it happens, it just seems like it's all luck. Like it's all chance, and wow, what are the chances of something like this? And so today I want us to look at this, and later on for your homework, if you've gotten one of our cards today, there's some study for you to go back and look a little bit later on these questions. But here we are in Exodus chapter 2, and we're continuing the story now. What's happened up to this point is Israel has come into the land of Egypt. They're beginning to spread. They're beginning to be fruitful, to multiply. Pharaoh wants nothing to do with these people there. In fact, he's now started a plan to clamp down. So he's enslaved the people. The other thing that he's trying to do is realizing that he won't stop their growth because God just keeps blessing them with babies, more babies, more babies. Now his plan is, well, if these people aren't going to stop having kids, what we're going to do is take every male child that's born and we're going to kill them. And now the way chapter 1 ends is it's open season on Hebrew boys. And so any boy that's born, it seems like every Egyptian has free license to go and find a baby boy and throw them into the Nile River to where they will drown or be eaten or whatnot. And so that's how we end that story in chapter 1. Now things are about to turn because now we are in chapter 2. Now hopefully some of y'all, if you were in suspense all week, could just read the next chapter and that would alleviate some of it. But if this is brand new to you, great. This will be fun. I hope that this helps alleviate some of the pressure from last week. But let me open us up with prayer, and then we'll go in and we'll begin to take on this text verse by verse together. Lord God, I thank you for today. I thank you for the text of Scripture. God, that you speak to us through these words, even though these are so old, God, these are more than 3,500 years old, these stories, these words, they're for us, they're for your church in every single generation. Lord, speak to us today in only a way that you can. Have your way with our hearts, Holy Spirit. We ask that you would be with those littlest ones who are next in the hall down in their class time, God, that you would bless them, that they would continue to love hearing the name of Jesus sung, taught to them. And God, that the things that are happening at the young ages that they are at, God, that it would just set them up for a life of following you and loving you. God, we thank you that we get to play roles like that and to invest in young ones like that too. I pray that you'd be with us today in all that happens in here. We ask these things in your name, Jesus. Amen. So let's look at chapter 2, and let's begin in verse 1. So we leave right where it's there's a hit out for Hebrew boys. Now we pick up in chapter 2, and here's what it says. Now a man from the family of Levi married a Levite woman. So Levi, remember, this is one of Jacob's 12 sons. That's the family of Levi. So that's what it means, right? It says the woman became pregnant and gave birth to a son. And when she saw that he was beautiful, she hid him for 3 months. But when she could no longer hide him, she got a papyrus basket for him and coated it with asphalt and pitch. She placed the child in it and set it amongst the reeds by the bank of the Nile. Then his sister stood at a distance in order to see what would happen to him. So let's talk about what is actually going on in these verses for just a moment here. So first off, it says that this Levite couple have a child. He's not the firstborn, by the way. You find out that he actually has 2 siblings older, but he's born in this period of time when this hit is put out for Hebrew boys. Now it says when she saw that he was beautiful, and you're like, wouldn't all moms find their babies beautiful? You know, everybody says, you got to see my beautiful baby. And sometimes you might think, nah, I don't know if that's that beautiful. Only a mother could love a face like that. But that's not what's being said here. She notices he's a healthy, strong baby, and she can't bring herself to doing what is demanded of her. In fact, if you were to look at what Hebrews 11:23 says, speaking about it, says that they decided to hide him because they don't actually fear Pharaoh at all. They decide that we're going to do what we feel God has called us to do, and we're not going to bring this baby out. Now, there's some speculation of what's the whole 3 months for. Now, some said, if you go back and look at maybe some of the older interpreters, like Jewish ones back in the day, they said, well, it could have been that he was premature, that people were noticing that this woman should be due at any time, and maybe he was early, and so they hid her and him, and just, people kind of forgot about him. I don't think that's the case. I think they've decided, we're going to hide this baby. We're going to pretend that he's been out, thrown into the river, and we're going to keep him indoors. But about 3 months, think about what it would take to hide a baby for 3 months. That's a pretty difficult thing, right? I mean, early on, when you get a newborn, there's a lot of sleeping, but then there's a lot of crying that come later on. And once you get to that 3-month time, she's at the point they say, we can no longer hide this child. Word's going to be out. Someone's going to see us. Someone's going to realize something's up. And they say, we got to do something. And they're desperate. So what do? Well, I think this is absolutely fascinating, by the way. When she could no longer hide him, she got a papyrus basket for him, coated it with asphalt and pitch. Let me show you something, by the way. This basket, that word, by the way, is used a previous time in the book before, and it's the word ark. It's the same word that is used in the Noah story, and for good reason, because what Moses, who wrote this book, is doing is he's saying something similar is going on here. In the same way that God took Noah and his family and put them in an ark and saved them through what was coming, this word choice, which he used at that time there, and now he uses it again here, he's the same author of both of these, right, is saying something similar is about to take place. So the readers of this passage in those days are looking, and they would recognize the word choice, the similarity here. It's hard for us because we just put basket, right? But imagine if we would translate it the way it's supposed to be in a papyrus ark. The problem is many of us would think giant, right? Like that's not what's going on. There's a little ark. And what do? In fact, similarly to what Noah did, right, is he had coated it with asphalt and pitch. Different words, but same idea. They're waterproofing this basket to put him in. And she placed the child in it and set it among the reeds by the bank of the Nile. And the sister stood at a distance in order to see what would happen. So technically speaking, right, they're following through with Pharaoh's orders, taking him down to the Nile. Now, look, here's something. All of us have been very influenced by the movies that we have seen on this. And one of the more recent ones, if you ever watch Prince of Egypt, has the scenario where she puts him down there and just shoots him down the Nile River. And you're watching him go over hippos and crocodiles and stuff like that. And that's not what the text tells us, right? The text tells us that they placed him in the reeds. Now, granted, still, we're trusting God here because you're trusting, first off, that your baby's going to stay in that basket. You're trusting God that that basket's not going to sink. You're trusting God that a crocodile's not going to come up and you're trusting God that nobody's going to stumble upon this baby, right? So they put the little girl, the sister, is going to be watching from a distance, but ultimately he's been placed in the reeds. He's not been shot down the Nile River. Now notice what happens next. It says, now Pharaoh's daughter went down to bathe at the Nile, while her servant girls were walking along the bank. Now, some would say, well, why would Pharaoh's daughter be doing this? And it could very well be that this is also more of a religious ritual for her. The Egyptians worshiped the Nile. And so here she is probably coming out for some sort of ritual, and she's going to go down to the Nile and begin to do something, to bathe, but maybe do something religious there. And she saw the basket amongst the reeds there, and she sent her slave girl to take it. She took it, opened it, and saw him, the child. And there he was, a little boy crying. She felt sorry for him and said, this is one of the Hebrew boys. Now, notice she feels sorry for him. That word is she felt pity. She has compassion on him. And she realizes that he's one of the Hebrew boys. Now, notice that's something that's kind of shocking because up to this point, we didn't know what's she gonna do, right? You think about this, Pharaoh's daughter, the same guy who has put a hit out for all Hebrew boys, she's the one who stumbles upon this baby. Now, what we don't know is, does the mom know that maybe that she's a compassionate one? Was the baby placed there by the family knowing that maybe she might come? Or is this just luck, right? That the baby's there and all of a sudden, who comes down? Is somebody expecting to have some maybe sort of religious ritual bathing time in the night and finds this baby, and all of a sudden she has compassion for a slave child? We're not quite sure, but she does though. So she finds the baby in the basket. Her heart is turned into compassion for this baby. And then notice what happens next. Then the sister said to Pharaoh's daughter. So she's around and she notices Pharaoh's daughter's got it. She notices they're probably playing with the baby, talking to the baby, because she notices this is a good thing, right, at this point. And she says, should I go and call a Hebrew woman who is nursing to nurse the boy for you? Now, this is not out of the ordinary, too, because back in those days, you'd have a wet nurse. That if you were going to adopt a baby, or, especially you would have a nurse who would wean this baby. And so she's necessarily saying, hey, if you want this baby, you want me to go grab someone who can nurse him? Because I'm sure there's plenty of Hebrew mothers in Egypt during this time who have the ability to nurse, but no baby anymore because of what Pharaoh's done. And so the little girl doesn't pretend like she belongs to this baby, but she approaches Pharaoh's daughter saying, do you want me to go find someone who can nurse this baby? Now notice what Pharaoh's daughter says. Go, Pharaoh's daughter told her. So the girl went and she called the boy's mom. So think of this, the change right now. So she goes and she gets her own mom. She gets Moses' mom. And so here's what happens. Pharaoh's daughter said to her, take this child and nurse him for me, and I will pay your wages. So think about the turn of events now. This mom has tried to hide her baby for 3 months, has to put the baby in the basket, has to follow through the orders with what Pharaoh has said. Pharaoh's daughter, out of all people, finds the baby and then has compassion on this baby and now says, hey, go find someone to nurse it. And who do we find is Moses' mom? And it said, I'm going to pay you to raise him and nurse him for me. How many moms got paid to nurse their kids for that time? And you're waking up all night, you think, I should have been paid. Well, she got paid to do all of this at this point. And Pharaoh's daughter saying, I'll pay the bills for you. Just take care of this baby. And she doesn't know necessarily this is the child's mom, but that's the game plan, right? So notice the woman who had to give up her child, right, took the boy and nursed him. Mom gets her child back. She's got the protection of Pharaoh's daughter around her at this point, because now she's holding on to something that belongs to Pharaoh's daughter. She found her. And it says this, when the child grew older, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter. And he became her son, and she named him Moses, because she said, I drew him out of the water. So when the boy grew older, some of your translations might say, when he was weaned. And if that's the case, in those days, that was probably 3 to 4 years old. They're still nursing to at least 3 or 4 years old. And so here we are at probably 4 years old. Moses has been living with his real biological Hebrew family. And 3 or 4 years old is then presented to Pharaoh's family. And it says that she brought him to him, and then Pharaoh's daughter names him, calls him Moses, which, by the way, is a play on words here, because if there's a lot of Moses names in Egyptian. Think of like Tutmoses, right? Those are all kind of part of that. So there's a name that goes with that because she's Egyptian, but there's also a play on words because in the Hebrew, it is I drew out of the water, right? And so there's kind of a play on words of why is his name Hebrew, is it Egyptian? Regardless, right, it tells us that his name is connected to the fact she goes, I pulled him out. He's mine. Probably if she's especially thinking that I've gone down for some religious ritual and the Nile has given me this child. It's clear to her that she doesn't have kids. I don't know why she doesn't have them, or at least why this one's special, but she wants this baby and adopts this baby. And it says that he becomes her son. She probably looks at him as special and set apart because how many of them have found these babies in the water like this? She probably thinks, look at what I've been given, and now I got to take care of what's been given to me. Now, we walk away from this first section, we have to ask, what is going on here, right? Is this random events? Is it luck? Is it fate? Well, how do we explain how everything just seemed to fit so perfectly here? Well, look, this is something that when we look at this is what theologians might call the providence of God. It's how God is working things through to his plan. Now, the text doesn't mention God in this, by the way. It doesn't mention that God was the one who does, but there's a lot to be said about how God works in other passages to show that this is exactly what's happening. If you were in our Wednesday evening class that we have here for our adults over here, we've gone through this. We've talked about this not that long, about a month ago, where we talked about how God does work providence through in all ways. He's how control he is. So if you've heard this, you've probably heard some of these verses. But this is important, right? We have to realize the Bible does not allow us to sit back and just say, wow, what a lucky chance that was. The Bible does not give us definitions or tell us that that's how it played out. In fact, there's so much more to it. Look what Jesus says. He gives us some insight into how God was really the one working behind the scenes. And look at this in Matthew chapter 10, verse 29. Aren't 2 sparrows sold for a penny? Yet not one of them falls to the ground without your Father's consent. Even the hairs of your head have all been counted, so don't be afraid. You're worth more than many sparrows. Look at this part, though, right here. Not one of them falls to the ground without your Father's consent. As Jesus is trying to talk about how valuable humanity is, he makes this comment saying that ultimately even the sparrows in the air do not fall to the ground until God is the one who's allowed them to fall. That God is the one keeping those birds in the air. They've got life because God's the one doing it. They'll drop when God's done with them and his time and his purpose is finished with them. That's how in control God is what Jesus is saying. Paul will go on a little bit in Acts, and notice what he says here. Talking about God, as he's talking to the Athenians, he says, neither is he served by human hands as though he needed anything, since he himself gives everyone life and breath in all things. From one man he has made the earth, he has made every nationality to live over the whole earth and has determined their appointed times and the boundaries where they live. He did this so they might seek God and perhaps they might reach out and find him, though he's not far from each of us. But notice this, right? He is the one who has determined their appointed times. He is the one who gives breath and life to all things. Essentially, here's the point, right? All those things that have just taken place in the story is because God was the one orchestrating it all. God was the one, they did it, and yet God was the one behind it, making sure it all played out according to what he wants to play out. In fact, he's got big purposes for this baby, as you'll find out. God was the one who said, well, this one's going to make it. This one, I've got a plan and a purpose as I'm orchestrating all things. It was not a chance that any of this takes place. But here's another point for you to figure out for your own life. If that's how God works here, could it be that he also does that with you? In fact, I would say that's how he does it with you. There's no such thing as luck. There's no such thing as chance. God is working through your life, and he's orchestrating things. You may not like how it all fits together sometimes, but he is fitting it together according to his own purposes and his own plan. So here we are, though. This incredible plan is taking place where this boy makes it out alive. We're focusing on this one baby boy amidst all the other Hebrew boys. And notice, go back to this and see what it says in verse 10. When the child grew older, she brought in the Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. She named him Moses because she said, I drew him out of the water. Now, we're about to make a jump in time from what happens from this verse to when he becomes an adult. And there's not a lot that we know about what happens. There's a couple things in the Bible that tell us what happened. Like, for instance, Stephen's sermon in Acts 7, he says, when he was put aside, Pharaoh's daughter adopted him and raised him as her own son. So Moses was educated in all the wisdom of the Egyptians and was powerful in his speech and actions. So the New Testament tells us that he became thoroughly Egyptian. All that stuff that we look at, those hieroglyphics on the walls, all the stuff that they were thinking about, talking about, guess what? He became schooled in that. He knew that stuff. He knows what they were thinking. He knows what they believed. And it says he was also powerful in speech and action, which is going to be interesting as we get into later on, of why would he then not feel he's so powerful? You know, it's really interesting too. There's some filler that goes on in extra biblical sources. If you were ever to look at the Jewish historian Josephus, who was writing about 70 AD, for the Romans, actually. He was a Jewish guy, but he was writing about all the events, and he talks about some of these events that took place, kind of rehashing them and telling the story for the Romans to know about where the people came from. He actually goes into some more detail, and you're kind of wondering, where did this come from? I don't know, but he talks about that, Moses, as he grew up, he became, people noticed him that he was pretty powerful, which is not off from what we see here in the text, that he is powerful in speech and actions, but they talk about that, that he was leading an army at one point for Pharaoh, kind of like trying to get rid of him, though, because they started to know that this Hebrew boy was growing up into a man and becoming powerful, and so leading an army and then comes back. And so there is some at least tradition that there was a big chunk of stuff that was happening from between when he's brought into Pharaoh's house until where he becomes an adult. Now, the book of Hebrews tells us this, though. By faith, Moses, when he had grown up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. And he chose to suffer with the people of God rather than to enjoy the fleeting pleasure of sin. So here's what happens here. I don't know when this takes place. He's brought into Pharaoh's family, but at some point, he's like, I don't want any part of this anymore. At some point, he knows that he's Hebrew too. Now, if you watch the old Charlton Heston 10 Commandments, right, there's this whole dramatic scene of he finds his own, I think it's like he finds the baby blanket, or people, or no, I don't know. I can't remember. We should watch it again. It's a 3-hour night we'll have together, right? And we'll have the intermission too, like they do, and do popcorn. But there's this part where somehow he finds out, and I don't know if he's always known. It could be that he's always known. He at least knows his family, it seems, because later on, when God says, hey, your brother Aaron's coming, he's not like, what? I have a brother? Oh my goodness, I didn't know this. So it seems like he's known of his Hebrew family. Maybe God has even allowed him to have contact with that Hebrew family that he was weaned in, or grew up nursing in. We're not sure of all that, but at some point he says, I'm not Egyptian. I'm Hebrew. And we know that he's powerful. Stephen says that, and he thinks he's pretty powerful because look at what happens in verse 11 of our story now. We'll go back to the Exodus story. Years later, after he had grown up, he went outside to his own people. So his own people, he's talking about his own people. These are the Hebrews he's looking for, and he observed their forced labor. He sees all that's been happening. They've been enslaved, right? He saw an Egyptian striking a Hebrew. Now, this word striking, by the way, this is not just he's hitting. This is striking, but it often sometimes carrying it with the idea of like this guy's trying to kill him, okay? It's a little bit deeper of just like, boom, I hit you, or I'm whipping you, right? This guy's actually trying to kill this Hebrew slave. And he says, and once again, notice how it says, one of his people. So Moses has identified now with the Hebrews. He still has the status of an Egyptian prince, but mentally he is now having compassion towards the Hebrew. Maybe, he starts to think of himself as maybe already kind of their leader based on what we see here. And looking around and seeing no one, he struck the Egyptian dead and hid him in the sand. So here's how this plays out. This guy is fighting a Hebrew, and one of two things has gone on. Obviously, right here, Moses, it says, looking all around and seeing no one, he's already trying to say, I'm going to try to get away with this if I can. This was not just it was a heat of passion. It was hot, but it was not like, it was just a mistake. I got carried away. It's premeditated what he was doing. It's either he's watching this Egyptian guy beat this Hebrew, and he's looking around saying, okay, nobody's here, I'm just going to kill him. Or after the guys beat him thoroughly, he follows him around and waits to where the guy's alone and then kills him and just buries his body in the Egyptian sand. Now, verse 13. He went out and he saw two Hebrews fighting. And he asked the one in the wrong, why are you attacking your neighbor? Once again, that's the same kind of word. That guy, he's seeing now a Hebrew fighting another Hebrew, and he goes up and he's trying to stop it. And it seems like he thinks he's got the ability to. Maybe because he has some status as an Egyptian prince still, or maybe he's now looking at these Hebrews saying, you guys, look, I'm one of you. I'm one of the big guys. And he says to him, hey, you shouldn't be doing this, right? And notice what the response has been. Who made you a commander and judge over us? Now, I think those words will sting and hurt Moses for a long time. as someone who thought he should be able to come in, thought he was doing the right, he was concerned about justice. And by the way, can I just stop for just a second? It's good, Moses is concerned about justice, but his killing the guy, this is not for us as people to say, well, Moses did it, so I should do it too, right? Like, there is no part in here that says, go likewise and do like Moses, right? Sometimes in Bible studies, we're like, well, the good guy did this, right? So it's okay. That's not the point, right? The point is he did something wrong. In fact, he's going to have to run for it in just a second. But here he is, this flawed individual comes and he thinks he can settle this. He feels like he's a man of the people, that he's helping them out, and they don't want any part of it. They push back on him. And then the guy says, are you planning to kill me as you killed the Egyptian? Then Moses became afraid and thought, what I did is certainly known. And when Pharaoh heard about this, he tried to kill Moses. But Moses fled from Pharaoh and went to live in the land of Midian, and he sat by a well. Some speculate, well, why is it that Pharaoh now would want to kill him? It was probably a newer Pharaoh now at this point. But it's also some speculation that if Moses is already at this point where he is starting to kind of view himself as more as a Hebrew and less as an Egyptian. Remember in chapter 1, this whole thing was they were nervous that the Israelites would one day revolt. And so here we are, we see one of their own who's lived in their house, who's grown up with them, who's powerful in speech and action, as Stephen said, has now taken matters into his own, and he's willing to kill Egyptians. He's stepping in trying to lead these people. And so Pharaoh thinks, okay, this is my shot to get rid of him finally. And so what does Moses do is he runs. He runs to the land of Midian. We say, well, where's Midian? I'm so glad you asked. Let me show you on a map here. Here is Egypt right here. So I'll just put Cairo. I did a Google of how long would it take to get to the land of Midian, right? And so here's what he did. It's about 678 kilometers. So that's about, 300 miles, a little more than 300 miles if he's going to do this. By the way, he's not going to go down the Egyptian roads. Because if Pharaoh's putting a hit on him, the last thing you're going to do is go down the very traveled road. So he goes probably at a different route. Down the wilderness roads, why I think this is probably how he knew where to lead the Egyptians or the Israelites later. But he goes across the Sinai Desert. And by the way, the land of Midian is modern day Saudi Arabia. And so he goes over here and he's camping out in this area in modern day Saudi Arabia. Well, who are the Midianites, you might say? Well, the Midianites are actually descendants of Abraham. In fact, if you were to read the story in Genesis 25, Abraham has a lot more children, by the way, than just Isaac and Ishmael. Lots more. And so these are the people that came, one of his children, the Midian, and they all settle in this area. They're people that live in that desert region, and that's where he goes and he sits by a well. Now, if you know anything about people who sit by wells in the Old Testament, usually that means, my one friend, he's a New Testament scholar, he says it always means someone's about to get married, right? But something's about to happen. There's an exchange that's going to take place here. And so notice what happens. He goes to the well, and it says this. Now, the priest of Midian had 7 daughters. Now, wait, hold on. Who is the priest of Midian? There's a guy. He's a priest of Midian out there. Priest of what? It appears very well that this guy might actually be someone who has a little bit of truth that he got from his great-great-grandfather or ancestor, Abraham. That, Abraham passed on this stuff. He didn't just pass it on to Isaac, but probably tried to point all of his children to faith in God. And so here is this guy who's a priest out in the middle of Saudi Arabia somewhere, trying to follow God with whatever limited knowledge he's got, just like the Hebrews do. So he's out in the desert. This guy says he's got 7 daughters. And they all came to draw water, and they filled their troughs to water their father's flock. Then some shepherds arrived and drove them away. But Moses came to their rescue and watered their flock. So these guys come and they begin to push back on them. They're pushing back on these probably because they're women, but it could also be, and there's some speculation, that the reason why these guys are harassing them, because this guy's a priest, right? Why would you take on the priest's family? It could very well be that it's one of the very few families that actually still try to follow the God of the Bible. And the rest of these, because what we know about the Midianites, by the time you get to the book of Judges, these are not good people. And they follow all sorts of crazy stuff. So it could very well be that this is really one of the few families that's trying to follow the Lord, and they're harassing them as well. And so here they are. They've harassed them. Moses jumps in. Once again, remember, this is a guy who's concerned with justice. That's an admirable thing. He doesn't want to just sit back and let things happen. He's going to fight if he can to try to help the situation. It says he came to their rescue, and then he waters their flock. And when they returned to their father, Reuel asked, why have you come back so quickly today? It's almost like he's surprised, like this is the natural thing. The guys come in and they push back on his family all the time. He's surprised that they came back quickly. And then what do we find out? They answered, an Egyptian rescued us from the shepherds. He even drew water for us and watered the flock. So where is he? He asked his daughters. Why did you leave the man behind and invite him to eat dinner? By the way, that's typical hospitality in the Middle East. You meet somebody, I remember growing up overseas, it's like you meet the taxi driver. He's like, do you guys want to come to my house and watch soccer and drink tea together? Day one, we just met you 5 minutes ago, man. You're talking to us and asking us to come over. And he's like, this guy rescued you? You didn't even ask her to come back and eat dinner? He's shocked that they didn't bring him back. So they go, and it says, Moses agreed to stay with the man. Now, the idea here is he's staying not just to stay. It seems like he's invited him in more than just stay and eat dinner, but this father is saying, this priest is saying, man, I could use somebody like you. I could use somebody like you around here to help me out, to help me with the land, right? And he gave his daughter Zipporah to Moses in marriage. He's going, I got 7 daughters. You want one, right? And here he is. Heck yeah, I'll take one. Now, by the way, I need to talk to you about his age. He's about 40 years old. A lot of times when you watch the movies, we don't know what age he is. He's 40 years old already. He's already had, this is the first third of his life. So he's got 40 years in Egypt. Now he comes, and by that time too, I think 40 is also just probably the way these people lived, probably a little bit younger. So he's in his 40s though. He comes, he agrees, he marries Zipporah. Verse 22, she gave birth to a son, and he named him Gershom. How many of y'all have named your kids Gershom? It just didn't have the same ring, I think, in English that it used to, maybe. I've been a resident in a resident alien in a foreign land, meaning I'm not where I'm supposed to be. Even when I was in Egypt, I'm a stranger to land. There's something else for me. Moses understands that his people are not supposed to be where they're supposed to be, and so he names his kid that. Notice, as we finish up, after a long time, the king of Egypt died. This has been probably, now we're thinking about what it takes between how long Moses is in Midian to where now he's about to come back to Egypt. So this time jump, we're in the 30 plus years he's been in Midian now. So at that point, after a long time, the king of Egypt died, meaning the one that was currently on the throne who was trying to kill Moses. Which, by the way, this is helpful. If you're ever like, well, who's the king of Egypt during the time? There's a very few that have lived that had 40 plus, almost 40-year reigns. That helps narrow down a lot of them of what time frame we're at. It's really fun to go do that sometime. In fact, last night, as I was going to go back over the notes, I got sucked in for like an hour again, going back. And I always like, no matter how many times I think I know it is, I always like going back into this, right? And so it's fun to think about it. Look at the picture, what their mummy looks like, or their sarcophagus, right? But here he is, that guy dies, but notice, and it's back in those days too, if a king died, there might have been an expectation that maybe he's gone and, there might be some relief because that guy was pretty rough. In fact, there is some precedent back in those days. If the king's gone, it might be time to release some of the slaves and kind of ease up on everything. But notice he dies, and it says the Israelites groaned because of their difficult labor. He doesn't stop. It seems to get worse. Notice what else it says. They cried out. And then it says, and their cry for help because of the difficult labor ascended to God, and God heard their groaning. I want you to notice in this passage, by the way, I highlighted them in different colors. 2 of these are verbs, 2 of these are nouns. They're all different words in the original to show Moses is giving like everything to talk about how bad and how much crying and groaning is going out at this point. How brutal, how hard life is in Egypt. It's not let off. It's gotten worse for them. And so every word you can think of is being used to say it's bad right now. But notice it says, now God heard their groaning. God heard their groaning, it says. And he remembered his covenant with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. And God saw the Israelites, and God knew. Let me stop for just a second and just say, isn't it ironic that the story starts with a cry of a baby who is found and heard, and deliverance comes from unlikely hands. And now, towards the end of the story, we end with a lot of crying going on, and deliverance is coming. Let me tell you what it means when it says, and God remembered his covenant. This does not mean that God has forgotten about them. In fact, that's the same word. If you go back, remember I said there's parallels between the Noah story here. Noah's in an ark. And in fact, as you read through, it says God, while they're in the ark, says God remembered Noah. Not that he forgot about Noah while he's in the ark the whole time. It's a word that means his attention is on them. He doesn't forget. It means that he's about to act and do something now. That's what the word means in the way they meant it. It says he remembered his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, meaning he swore that he was going to do some things. He was going to bring them out at some point. He was going to bring deliverance to them. It says he remembered that covenant. And then it also says he saw the Israelites and he knew. He knows everything that's been going on. He's watched all of it going on, and he's about to act. That's how the story ends. That's how chapter 2 ends. He's ready to do something. That's what those verses mean. That's what the Hebrew mind would have thought out. They cry out, and God has been completely aware, and he's about to start working the wheels in motion to unfold his plan. So here's what I want to think of as we take a step away for just a moment on this passage. I think it's fascinating to think that as these people are crying out at the end of it, it says God knew, he saw and he knew, but recognize that this whole point of the story is God has already been working wheels in motion to unfold his plan. 40 years, they are looking and they're crying out. And 80 years before, right? Because Moses, it's about 80 years old at this point now, at the end of the chapter. 80 years before, he saved a little baby in a basket to be picked up by Pharaoh's wife. Do you understand how crazy this story is the more you think about it? They're crying out, and yet God has already known he was about to work, and he was already working a plan way before they even cried out like this. He was already working a plan with this little boy. It's not that he just found Moses to be important to him. No, he had always thought that this was the way, he always knew that this was the way it was going to play out. And so 80 years prior to any of this crying out and the burning, the burdens and the groaning, crying out to God, hey, please help us now. He's like, what the text is telling us is he already started a plan 80 years ago to get this rolling. It takes some time. You think, why would it just be an instant? But that's not how it works sometimes. God, though, has started this. He's not distant. He is caring. He's got plans moving even when you can't see it. We've already seen it. He's working things, and it's behind the scenes happening, and we have no control over it. But God's working and caring. He has complete control of the situation. Think about what Jesus tells us in Matthew 6 here. But when you pray, go into your private room, shut the door, pray to your Father who's in secret. And when your Father who sees in secret will reward you. And when you pray, don't babble like the Gentiles, since they imagine they'll be heard for all their words, their many words. Don't be like them. And then notice what he says here. This is always something that bothers me, but I think in light of the story, it just makes so much sense now. Don't be like them, because your Father knows the things you need before you ask him. I think it's important for us to recognize God wants us to pray. He wants us to cry out to him and to call on. But what we should also recognize how sovereign and how powerful our God is, that while we're crying out to him, he has probably already been working so many things behind the scenes that we couldn't even fathom. He knows what we need. He wants us to pray. I mean, that's the thing you'll never figure out, by the way, all the time. How does that all work? As I cry out to him and he's going to work in some way, but also recognize he's way bigger than you could imagine, and he's more in control than you could ever imagine. He's already been working things for his own plan. So here's a question. Wherever your burden is right now, maybe you're somebody at the end of the day, you're saying, look, I feel more like I'm not that cheerful right now because I got a lot more burdens that are on me right now. I feel like I've done a lot more crying out. When you think about this story, when you think about what Jesus has taught here, how can you worry? Shouldn't this change how we look at events in our life? Shouldn't this change how we see how control God is of all things going on? I want to stop one more thing and think about as we close out of here is think about this for just a second in terms of your salvation. I want to talk to Christians. I want to talk to non-Christians for a second. All of you in this room, have you ever thought about what it took to save you? Did you know that God not only orchestrates all things in our life, but God is the one who orchestrates, and not just for the big important people, right? This is not a story just to say, well, he did that for big people like Moses, right? And big people like, the nation of Israel. The church is his special people too, guys. He does more than just every day, though. Notice what the author of Hebrews tells us in chapter 12 here. Since therefore we also have such a large cloud of witnesses surrounding us, let us lay aside every hindrance and the sin that so easily ensnares us. Let us run the race that lies before, with endurance, the race that lies before us. Now, a lot of time I've always thought about this passage and thought about the first part, the cloud of witnesses and the race. It's the second verse that shocks me, and it fits so well with this passage here. Keeping our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer. That word actually means the originator of it all. And the perfecter of what? Our faith. For the joy that lay before him, he endured the cross, despising the shame, sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. You see what this passage is telling us is that your faith, your coming to know him, was not because you worked so hard at it, is he was the one who originated all of that faith. He is the reason why you're here today. He is the one who, not only does he orchestrate our lives, but he was the one orchestrating behind the scenes how you would actually even come to know him. And I think as we close out and as we get ready to take the Lord's Supper, think about that, Christian, that you're here today not because chance somebody shared the gospel with you and it got accepted, was that God was the one orchestrating all of that. Everything that ever happened, how many times you had to hear it, how many times that you rejected and yet he pursued you still, right? All of that. How many times you went away and you went on your own path and yet he still pursued you because he was the one originating all of that faith to bring you in. You didn't bring yourself in, he brought you in. I want you to think about this for just a moment. When you get ready to take the Lord's Supper, recognize I'm here because of him coming for me, orchestrating for me my salvation. Maybe you're not a Christian here. I want you to know that, guess what? God has you here today for a reason. It could very well be that he wants you to hear these things. He wants you to hear another time that you're not going to save yourself by your works. That it's only through the work of Jesus Christ. He came, he lived a perfect life in our place. He died on the cross. God punished him and then raised him from the dead 3 days later to show that he will take your life, your works, your record, throw that all in the tomb and raise you up and give you a perfect record of Jesus to stand in. You don't face God the Father on Judgment Day in your own works anymore. You face him in the record of Jesus. That is open to you today. He brought you here today to at least hear that again. So what's your response to that? Do you recognize that God could be drawing you in? Maybe you said, I just came because a friend, I just saw a sign or whatnot. But guess what? That's all God working in this. So don't leave here today without considering, say, God, if you're out there, what do you want me to do? How do I respond to this? So I'm going to pray now. And normally every Sunday when we would close and we would have a response time and sing, but I want to have our deacons come forward. We're going to serve the Lord's Supper here. And as I pray, I want us to start our hearts to say, God, examine me. Maybe you've lived your life more recently to say, I've not really thought about God much at all. I know he saved me, but maybe you say, I haven't really considered, I've lived a lot more of worry. I've lived a lot for myself. Whatever that is, we want to spend your time. The text tells us to examine our hearts. And so I want you to spend some time as the plate is being served to you to examine your heart. Think about what you were like, maybe you need to repent today, but maybe for some of you, it's just need to sit there and marvel at the wonder it is that you're even here today, that you've been saved because he pursued you first.